Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as préféré, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, our weekly talk show that brings you up to speed on what exactly is going on in the EU capital and beyond. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up this week, the EU quarter is back to life after a restful summer break. But for neighbouring Ukraine, this summer was exhausting. Russia pounded the country with constant attacks, one missile even damaging the EU's delegation in Kiev. With diplomacy having reached a dead end, we're asking what exactly is the EU's plan now to help end the never-ending war? And ever heard of the EU-Mercosur deal? That's that huge trade pact that was sealed back in December 2024 between Brussels and the South American countries Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay. EU capitals still have to give their blessing to the arrangement that's great for business but could be disruptive for our farmers and the environment. We take a closer look at the small print in a context of Trump tariff tensions. A warm welcome to our guests this weekend. Stephen Everett, the Director of the European Union's Institute for Security Studies. Welcome.
Thank you.
Maria Tadeo, the European correspondent for the geopolitics magazine Le Grand Continent.
Thank you so much for this first show.
Yeah, great to have you with us. And finally, Thomas Waits, that's the Austrian farmer and MEP from the Green Party. Welcome.
Great to see you back.
So lovely to have you all with us. But
Sure.
Before we bring in your analysis, as always, let's just hear what exactly is on the minds of European leaders this week.
A few months ago, there was a glimmer of hope that a US-sponsored diplomatic push could launch a process that would stop at least the fighting in Ukraine. Yet, the situation now seems worse than before. The summer months saw the most destructive Russian attacks on the capital Kiev alone since the beginning of the war. Bilateral talks between Ukraine and Russia and a subsequent peace agreement, so desired by Donald Trump, are more elusive than ever before. The Alaska summit is almost already a distant memory. Instead, Vladimir Putin seems determined to bring Ukraine to its knees, come what may. Worse, in China this week, he defended the invasion and blamed the West for it. So what's next? Can Europe muster the solidarity and support necessary to keep Ukraine in the fight? Will the brutal summer become a brutal fall?
So there you go. This summer saw more attacks on Ukraine than ever in terms of volume, intensity and, of course, human cost. Is Putin, Stephen, trying to find a military end here, as he does not seem to have any interest in peace?
I think Putin has been trying to impose his will on Ukraine for 3 years and arguably longer. And I think we need to be realistic about what's going on as well. So the scenario that we were going to end up in a relatively quick ceasefire and then a bigger peace deal, I think is moving further away. So that means for Europeans, we got to be prepared to do the twin strategy, which is first more support to Ukraine, and we can talk about what that means, but also more pressure still on Russia. And I think part of what's going on is also persuading the other actor in all of this, Donald Trump, of the insincerity of Vladimir Putin.
Because meanwhile, we heard as well from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warning this week in Luxembourg that the threat from Russia is increasing every single day. And that peace agreement, Maria Tadeo, is still in its very early phase. The Alaska summit was a joke, right?
I mean, absolutely. I think the Alaska summit, however, was very useful for Russia and the Russian president because he was reinserted in the international conversation. This is someone who for 3 years, very few leaders, except for maybe China, were willing to sit down. And this time, President Trump took this one-on-one. And again, I think it reinforces this narrative from Russia, which is very convenient for the Kremlin to say we are a great power, so we only speak to the great powers of the world. That is China and the United States. Ukraine at this point, no great interest. The European Union, not on our level. I think that the symbolic nature of that meeting in Alaska was hugely important for the Russians. I think it was obviously in detriment to Ukraine. And we saw this effort from the Europeans to go back to the question of what can they do to then head out to D.C. and all speak, the six of them with Zelensky, to try to counter that narrative. The problem is that on the ground, the ceasefire is nowhere near. And again, this meeting even between Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, again, nowhere near, and there's no deadlines and also no repercussions for missing those deadlines.
And what's the mood then in the European Parliament about all this? Of course, it's just reopened after the summer recess.
Exactly. I mean, if we try to rely on Trump and if we put our hopes on the Trump administration to help us out with this European war, I think we're mistaken. We need to take the destiny of our continent into our own hands and take our own decisions. And if we look now, we have the 19th package of sanctions. Does that mean that the other 18 packages were insufficient? Obviously, yes, because if you need 19 packages, I mean, we have to admit that we were not ambitious enough. We were not sharp enough, even though when we look into economic sanctions. And the second story that we see is that Ukraine is now, meanwhile, attacking the infrastructure of Russia, as Russia did for the last 3 years. They're attacking rail, they're attacking oil infrastructure, which is the exact right thing to do to weaken the Russian troops. And for this, they needed long-range or medium-range missiles, which obviously they are now building by themselves, because we Europeans were not brave enough to give them the material that they need to defend themselves and to actually break the lines of support for the Russian army inside.
Yeah, if we could have done more, that war could have ended much earlier. And we saw as well last week Russian missiles striking an area just a few metres from the EU delegation in Kiev. The EU ambassador to Ukraine, that's Katerina Mathernova, she told me that nobody luckily was injured as it happened at 5 o'clock in the morning, but the windows were destroyed, computers were damaged, doors jammed and cars affected. Now her staff are shocked, but they are fixing the damage fast to be able to reopen soon. Take a listen.
The attack of last week by Russia was quite shocking. Everyone in Europe should be shocked that Russia targets a building so close to the EU delegation that a blast wave simply causes this level of damage. The Russian version of peace is to terrorize the civilians. So during the day, life goes on as normal, but then especially on weekends, especially at night, the attacks come, they disrupt sleep, they disrupt normal life. And the worst part is that you really cannot plan anything, right? You have a whole generation of people who cannot not only fulfill their dreams, but they cannot plan beyond a day or two because you never know what's going to happen.
So that's Ambassador Katerina Mathernova there. So the question is, how should Brussels now react to this attack? We heard from Ursula von der Leyen saying it was an attack on the EU and on Ukraine and sanctions was the way out. We saw Foreign Ministers Maria last weekend meeting in Copenhagen to discuss this 18th package of sanctions, but it's not really hitting the Russian economy hard enough yet.
Well, at this point, no. And also we should just talk about this incident that happened in the EU embassy, which, again, it's incredibly serious. I think we've gotten to a point where we almost make it seem like it's normal. You have an attack on a diplomatic building. That is absolutely insane, actually. Let's use that word because that's what it is. But also, let's not forget, Ursula von der Leyen had a problem on her jet. The GPS jammed by what the Bulgarians say was a form of Russian intervention. I mean, this is very serious what is happening. I think there's forms of hints and a form of we're not scared of the EU, but also we're not concerned because you're not a great power anyway in terms of Russia. But also there are no repercussions. I think with this package, what we're going to see very soon in the next 2 weeks is another package to sort of put this pressure on Russia. But I think the point here, and this is really what the Europeans are trying to focus on, is how to sway President Trump. That is really the point when it comes to the sanctions, when it comes to the pressure on Russia, when it comes to anything going forward in terms of a potential ceasefire. All of this, it comes through Trump. And I think the point now from the Europeans is to really engage in those conversations and try to sway the American president. The problem is that's not really happening either.
Yeah, and let's just reflect. You mentioned that incident as well in Bulgaria where Ursula von der Leyen was circling over an airport for many minutes, allegedly because the GPS had been hacked.
Yeah. Look,
have we proof of that, Stephen Everett?
No, I think it's part of a wider pattern that Maria was also talking about. I mean, there's a terrible war in Ukraine going on, but we have a much bigger Russia problem. And Russia is attacking European interests and European societies almost on a daily level.
Already, yes.
So there's the GPS jamming, and it happened to the president's plane, but there's also around Kaliningrad. There's the cutting of the undersea cables. I mean, there's an industrial scale disinfo operation that is, causing havoc in our societies. So I think, and on all of these points, what I would like to say is there are things that we can do back. Because there's a degree of psychology of weakness that I detect. And Maria referred to that, some of it. And I think we as Institute, we try to inject concrete ideas on how we can unpower Russia. We can limit the capacity of the Kremlin to hurt us. We can do things on the shadow fleet even without the Americans. Much better with the Americans, but we can do it ourselves as well. We can take action on this industrial disinfo campaigns and so on and so forth. And it's time that the Europeans regain some of this yes we can mentality. Otherwise, the Kremlin will push further and further.
Yeah, because I mean the consequences, if for example that attack in Kiev would have been a couple of hours later, could have lost many of the delegation that worked there. Or if that plane, more sinister, imagine what the consequence could have been.
Absolutely. I mean, two things. I mean, first of all, we as a European Union can stop to finance that war by buying goods from Russia. And I'm not just talking about gas, especially my own country, Austria, my neighboring countries. We were in a very high dependency, and this needs to be understood. But we had years now to decouple, and we need to finally decouple. And it's not just about gas. It's also about, wood, steel, potassium, fertilizer. Yeah, we don't want to hurt our agriculture. We don't want to hurt our businesses. But that's the weakness that we have. We're not ready to really walk the talk. And this is what we need to do. But what we also see is that Putin is coming under incredible pressure internally because he's not winning that war. And he's wasting lives of thousands and thousands of men. He's destroying the economy. If you look at the incomes of big Russian companies, it's crashing. The income is crashing. And you have seen major arrests, like a whole wave of arrests into the army, like high-level generals and so on. So basically FSB is taking over the power because, I think he's right so, he fears more and more that he will be taken out of power internally, not externally by Trump or by Zelensky. So there's quite a pressure on the Russian president, and this is what we have to accelerate.
And the IMF has predicted, in fact, that the growth rate is just 0.9% for this year in Russia. So it will be really how long can the economy last. But speaking of unity in Europe, let's talk about the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico. Where was he this week? He was in China.
He was in China?
Sitting down with President Putin.
Yeah. Look, and he wasn't the only leader. It was another leader, not an EU leader, but also the Serbian president was there. And look, member states make their own decisions on these things. But I think from an EU overall unity perspective, it wasn't a great sight.
Calling for a standardisation of relations again with Slovakia.
But it's also, if I may say, the fault of the institutions, but also the council, and the fact that there has been no repercussions every time there's been a trip like this. And I remember a few years ago when there was a diplomatic trip between the Hungarian foreign minister who decided to meet up with his Russian counterparts. The EU sort of acted like that had never happened. Viktor Orban, when he first met with Vladimir Putin, the EU, and I remember that week there was also a European Council, nobody talked about this. I think there's now a series and a number of meetings have happened and there are no repercussions to it. The European Union sort of just has accepted there's a problem in Slovakia, there's a problem with Hungary, but as long as they don't block big packages, that is it. But I think we're in a form of almost schizophrenic episode where we say we have to be ready for a Russian confrontation. There's still oil contracts that are happening in this market in countries that are being supplied. And we also accept the European leaders sit around the table, but they can also talk to Russia on their own without carrying this European line. So I think that this is also the problem with the EU not being able to be forceful at times with
So what should the institutions be doing, Thomas, apart from perhaps a slap on the wrist or a hard phone call from the Commission President?
I mean, it has been accepted with Orban, so why should Fico not do it? He learned his lesson. Or you also mentioned the Serbian President Vučić. I mean, we're still financing this country with huge amounts of European taxpayers' money while we see that Serbia is backtracking on democracy, it's backtracking on rule of law. And it's basically, the Serbian politicians regularly travel to Russia. They even have contracts, agreements, defense agreements, and so on. So, I mean, we need to face reality. And at a certain point, ask our leaders inside the European Union, but also in accession countries, okay, where do you want to go? Who are your friends? You need to decide. And we're not ready to still give resources if you're not clearly joining the European club.
I agree with that. But I think one of the answers is also that increasingly business is moving elsewhere, right? There's stuff happening in the European Union, and we talked about sanctions, and you need to do that at 27. There are other things, and the coalition of the willing. There are smaller groups of countries that to bypass the individual blockages of this country or that country now. And I think this is a big shift, actually, in how EU foreign policy generally works. Some of it happening maybe on Gaza or in other topics too. So this is one of the ways that the system tries to, if it isn't able to do what you both are describing, which is, instill discipline and hold people to, business goes elsewhere.
Well, this is, you're mentioning this anti-circumvention tool, right, that's in this 19th package, because, of course, as you mentioned earlier, if the other 18 packages of sanctions would have worked, we wouldn't need a 19th package, but we still don't even have clarity on that package, Maria.
Yes, and again, one of the focus points now is that there is a question of whether you want to expand those sanctions or you want to enforce them in a much stronger way. I think for the European Union, they have decided, well, we could sanction most of it. We have already. Now it's a question of circumvention also with partner countries and third level countries that we know work in a way that there is active circumvention going on, or in a sort of way they serve to clean up the goods and then sell them anywhere elsewhere or go to Russia. I think that that's where the EU will focus. I thought it was very interesting in the previous package. They went after Chinese banks. So now they show that they are willing to go areas where they weren't willing to go previously. But I think at this point, however, the EU said if there is no ceasefire, if Putin doesn't show there are going to be meaningful steps to peace, there's going to be major sanctions that are going to happen. That deadline was missed. Also, when it comes to the United States, they promised sanctions and that has gone completely out the window. There are no deadlines for that too. I think the problem that we're facing now is that the EU can do things alone, but it also has to work in tandem with the United States. That is a problem with the foreign policy that we have. And at this point, the US has a very ambiguous tone when it comes to Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Of course, the main thing is that Ukraine, right, gets the security guarantees they need. And that's also been discussed this week in Paris at the Coalition of the Willing.
Exactly. So that's the Coalition of the Willing I was alluding to. So some of the business is moving elsewhere. And in addition to the whole discussions around sanctions and the architecture and the enforcement, Ukraine needs weapons still. It needs more weapon systems than it has today. And we all know what they need. And it's on air defense, it's on long-range strikes, it's on electronic warfare and what have you. And that needs to be ramped up, even if the United States is not doing so. I mean, the preferred scenario is that we buy it from the United States because they have it more readily available than Europeans, but also European countries do have some of these systems available but have refrained from supplying it. So that's the first part of the security guarantees, and you get then closer to a Ukraine instead of armed forces that is able to defend their country even against the onslaught. The second element is training inside Ukraine. Yeah? Europeans do train Ukrainian armed forces, but they do so in EU countries, in Poland, in Germany, and elsewhere. And it will be much more logical, as the Ukrainians have been asking for some time, to do some of that training also on Ukrainian soil, closer to the battlefield.
Now that the Ukrainians as well are so professional.
I know, and we could learn a thing. We could learn a thing or two ourselves from this, right? Third element is the production of weapon systems on Ukrainian soil. As you say, maybe these people know how to wage a war. These are how to defend yourself against an aggressor. And they have phenomenal capacities, including in missile production, not just on the drone that everybody is excited about. And we should really, I think, ramp up that. So there are a number of things in addition to the sanctions discussion that we can and should do today.
Yeah, and stop the shadow fleet. Imagine from the point of view of Mr. Putin, you have Kaliningrad, which is surrounded by NATO states. There's huge amounts of oil leaving on a shadow fleet from Kaliningrad, going through NATO territory, going through the Öresund. We have all the means to stop that every day. We need to do it. We need to cut them off this stream of income.
But will we, or will we be sitting here this time next year having the same conversation?
Well, hopefully not. But Maeve, I think there's something that you touched upon which is incredibly important now, and it has to do with, it's not just the sanctions but also the security guarantees, because every Ukrainian official that I've spoken with, and this is entirely logical, they say before you sit down with the Russians you need to know what those security guarantees are going to look like. They also say the central piece of our security guarantees will be the Ukrainian army. There's a lot of ideas around the Coalition of the Willing, boots on the ground. They don't want to train, but they say they will provide a backup force. I mean, I find that difficult to believe how you escalate so much in very short time. There's the idea of Giorgia Meloni, NATO without NATO, which again is very difficult in the practicalities. But the Ukrainians all agree they need to know what those security guarantees will look like before they concede anything. This is entirely logical. But also this idea that in the future, the defense of Ukraine comes through a very strong Ukrainian army. And that is where the EU industrial policy could fit in.
Makes sense?
Makes a lot of sense. And, there are existing plants in different parts of Ukraine where they make these equipment that the Ukrainian armed forces will need today, but also into the future as a deterrent capacity for Russia not to attack again. And what they lack above all is capital. And last time I checked, we're 27 relatively rich countries, and we could provide that. Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, there are a couple of member states that are really moving into this space. And I think that could really be a significant plank of Europeans providing concrete support to Ukraine under any scenario, because we don't know what Mr. Trump is or isn't going to do. And as Thomas alluded to at the beginning, we have to think of this whole issue much more in terms of what are we willing to do ourselves to make us less dependent on the decision of this gentleman or that gentleman.
And you spent the summer in Austria among your voters. What are they feeling about this? Are they willing?
Voters are tired of that war, and they are expecting from us here in Brussels that we finally take harsh measures, that we step up our efforts. So even though it's even voters across the whole political spectrum. People are also scared that this war escalates to a dimension that we all don't want to think about.
But this makes the coalition of the willing also difficult, and you see why this is such a sensitive topic, because you talk about the voters are fatigued, they're tired, but they're also scared. What the EU now says, if we really want to take control of the security of our continent, this coalition of the willing implies boots on the ground. In Italy, I was just there on the weekend. This is completely not an option. Giorgia Meloni cannot do this, and the government is at very risk of serious tensions internally if that is the way it goes. So I think even of what can the EU and the Europeans do, this is incredibly complex also from a political standpoint. And we see that this question of potentially boots on the ground, which it will take to monitor NEP's agreement, it's incredibly sensitive on a voter level sphere. I'm not sure how many would actually want to do that in real time.
In my country, there's not a lot of support for that, for boots on the ground, actually. Yeah?
No. And according to a poll, in fact, from European Movement, there's not a lot of support either.
No, but what I hear
but
more
on that
and more...
note, we will have to bring that this conversation to a close. Stay with us, though, here on Euronews, because we'll be back very soon to hear how a massive trade deal with South America that could save European companies $4 billion in export duties per year jumped a nuttle hurdle this week. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, My Love, our weekly European politics show with me, Maeve McMahon. Well, there was hardly a day this summer when the word tariff or Donald Trump wasn't mentioned in the news. And it's for this very reason that the EU is desperately looking for other trading partners and new markets. Now, Brussels has been working on a massive deal for decades with the Mercosur bloc. And this week, after years of stop-and-go talks, the final text was sent to EU capitals, who have to give it their final blessing, as well, of course, as the European Parliament. So, Maria, just briefly, what would this deal mean for Europe? What sectors would it benefit?
God, and I feel like you and I have talked about this now so many times. But look, this is the real... deal now at this point. Mercosur, many years in the making. You have a commission now, and this changes everything. That is determined 100%, I'd even say 1,000% to get this done. But for two reasons. Obviously, it would open up the market with big countries like Brazil. This is an enormous country. Also, that could be incredibly beneficial for some of European exporters. But also, there's a twofold form of strategy here. One is that the EU clearly wants to extend political partnerships, and they see Mercosur as one. And also, two, that this is a sort of counterbalance response to the tariffs from President Trump and a very difficult relationship that he has with Latin America. So in my view, this is going to get sent with a lot of momentum, a lot of impetus. The momentum, if I were to say, is to get it done, but I'd be curious to hear what the European Parliament is going to do. But the way that this is going to be presented by the Commission is that this makes complete sense now. Not approving it would be contrarian to the foreign policy that we say we want to establish. It makes sense politically, and it makes sense on the trade tariffs if you want to cut deals with other countries and avoid the Trump tariffs. So,
well, as I said, of course, EU capitals will have to give their blessing. Briefly, is it good news or bad news? And then I'll bring in our MEP, of course, who'll have to vote on it.
No, I think it's good news. I think it sends exactly the signal that the European Union remains open to the rest of the world, that we're interested to stand by the rules-based trade system, that we want to have access to new markets, and that we don't follow this path of unilateral tariffs, of coercion, and what have you. So I'm a big fan of the European Union pursuing this. Mercosur is one example, but there's also India, there's Indonesia, there are many. Mexico is part of the discussion. So I like that. I like that signal that it gives, but I recognize that the politics is difficult, and Thomas can speak in a minute from the Parliament. I just observed that in my own country, the country I know, the Netherlands, listen, we build our economy on access to global markets, and in the Netherlands, this is a tough sell. So we will have to make the case. I think we have arguments, but don't take it for granted.
Big tough sell as well in France. I think Poland were hesitant too, Ireland and Austria, in fact, your country. And you'll, of course, get the vote.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, we're having trade relations to the Mercosur bloc, quite respective trade relations. It's not that they are just starting or not starting with this trade agreement being signed. And second, I mean, this trade agreement is negotiated since more than 20 years. Even though now it's a good argument to diversify our trade relations globally, and I'm in absolute support of that. So I'm not against the trade agreement as such, but in the current form, I still have a lot of criticism to point out.
Would you vote against it?
Well, let's see how the text actually looks like. We still have to go through it in detail, and let's see what the compensation mechanisms are. But I mean, just from my reality, I'm a farmer, and farmers are approaching me and telling me, "Look, Thomas, we like you also what you do as a green. You know we have to adapt to climate change. We know we have to work with nature. We know we have to respect human rights. Labor security and all of this. But you cannot put us in a competition with other players with international imports which do not comply with these rules. That's just unfair competition. And we need to listen to that because it's a real concern based on facts. And today already, I mean, we're losing 800 farms a day in the European Union. You can't neglect that. So we have to find ways to protect our quality production in the European Union.
Well, there
so
are
for this
plans
we need,
to put some sweeteners in there for France. We'll have to look, of course.
Not legally binding. This
You're more in the no
text.
camp.
You're in the no camp.
But that's why I'm here today. Huh?
That's why you're here today. And Morgan Oddy is a vegetable farmer in Brittany. She's also very much in the no camp. She's been on the streets for the last couple of years protesting with her association Via Campesina. We can take a listen to her.
As European farmers, we are strictly against this EU-Mercosur free trade agreement that will destroy European farming sector. For example, in the beef sector, in Latin America, they are able to produce beef meat much cheaper than what we can do in Europe. So if that meat from Latin America gets imported in Europe, this will destroy completely the farmers who are in the beef sector. So what we're asking for is food sovereignty. It's the protection and the support for local farming system. We are against free trade agreement, and we ask for policies based on food sovereignty.
Morgan Oddy there. How would you calm her fears?
Look, it's very difficult because, again, the Commission is going to say the global geopolitical momentum is definitely with this deal, both politically and in terms of the trade agenda. If you have the tariffs, the best way you can do, the smart thing to do is to reach out to new markets and third partners. The problem is, and perhaps it's a legacy also of the 25 years in the making, is that Mercosur has a very, very negative connotation. For the farming community, it's almost like toxic. I think you can argue about some of the mechanisms that will be installed. You say some of them are not really legally binding. That's going to be a problem. But I think, to me, the real issue is how to package this.
Is
because
brand,
Mercosur,
right?
maybe change the name. That may be a way forward, because politically it's just incredibly toxic in this sector, and especially in a country like France, for example. It's universally hated across the political spectrum. Good luck dealing with the politics of it.
And that would be your job to convince your voters.
Wow.
But it does send a message to Trump, this deal. Stephen.
It would, and I think it would, and not just to Trump, but to partners around the world, that you can rely on the European Union to do deals that are, mutually beneficial, and none of this unilateral coercion that you get from others, and not just from Trump, by the way. So I like that. And I also
win-win approach.
It's a win-win approach, and I think it's also we have to find about. Yes, there are concerns in the farming community. We heard them loud and clear, but there are other economic sectors that we also need to take care of, and it's not true that this.
Thomas,
I acknowledge these arguments, and also that democracies of this world should cooperate more closer in times of rising authoritarianism. Absolutely, but then we need a trade agreement that is actually strengthening democracy in Brazil, as an example. And if a trade agreement only profits a very few multinational, big agro-industry businesses and actually harms the wider population, we're not doing a favor to democracy in Brazil. So we need a trade agreement that is more on eye level, that respects also more the realities on the ground. So I'm in favor of the trade agreement, but I think we still need to fix a few points here to make it really,
and I'm
to
sure
make it
we'll revisit this
profitable
discussion
for both
when
sides,
it goes to the capitals and, of course, the European Parliament. But on that interesting point, we can bring this discussion to an end. Thank you so much to our panellists for being with us this weekend, and thank you so much for watching. See you soon here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, our weekly politics show about European news and current affairs. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my guest, Stephen Everett, the Director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies, Maria Tadeo from Le Grand Continent, and the Austrian Green MEP Thomas Fates, we're just taking a look back at the news headlines of the week across Europe. And one that needs some attention is the shaky political situation in France. The current Prime Minister, François Bayrou, has called for a vote of confidence on September 8th to see if lawmakers support his 44 billion belt-cutting budget proposal. It includes major spending cuts and even raising 2 national public holidays. To hear what his chances are and how the French are feeling, our Paris correspondent sent us this report.
French Prime Minister François Bayrou is fighting for his political survival. But after multiple long days of talks in Paris, it looks like his chances are becoming increasingly slim. He met with various party leaders to try to shore up support before Monday's crucial confidence vote in the lower house of parliament. But most opposition groups have already said that they will vote against him. This impending defeat not only means that Bayrou's government will collapse, but will also likely plunge France back into political uncertainty. And as tensions are at an all-time high, we've asked certain Parisian residents what they think of the situation.
When a government has been voted out of office, the President of the Republic appoints a new Prime Minister. The problem is, who will he appoint?
Le problème, qui va-t-il nommer?
Je trouve pour tout le monde, ça nous stresse beaucoup. Je connais personne qui ne pense pas du tout.
I think it's very stressful for everyone. I don't know anyone who isn't thinking about what's going to happen soon. In France, we're all on edge. And I think, yes, this period we're entering is really going to lead to a lot of protests. And yes, I think it's going to be complicated.
Oui, ça va être compliqué, je pense.
Sophia Kaskankova reporting for us there. So as you can see, the French are stressed. Some of them are furious. They don't want to have their Easter Monday public holiday taken away or Victory Day. You live in France. How do you feel about this?
Look, I can share this sense of uncertainty, degree of malaise. I think there's the French political system has been struggling for a number of years now, really to build a coalition that can hold. And what you see is a coming together of the far right and the far left to bring down the centrist coalition that has been led by President Macron. I would say this is not just a French problem, because the kind of issues and the kind of dynamics, the political dynamics, where the center is weak and the extremities are rising, is what we see in many, many European countries. And the second thing we see in many European countries, and this is what is bringing it to a head, is we're broke. And there's
we're broke. I think you have nailed it there. We're broke. I mean, Thomas Fates, is it time for us just to accept that we have to work more and give up a few public holidays?
No, I don't think so. I think the first answer that Macron has been given and Bayrou has been given is austerity. And if you see in society who is actually paying the tax base of our countries, it's the working people. It's the people that have an income. The more money you have, the less taxes you pay from a certain amount of money on. So we need to look into actually taxation of the big wealthy incomes. We need to look into taxation of the big tech companies as an example. And this was the main aim of Trump in all these tariff talks. He wanted to prevent Europeans to actually tax the big tech companies. So if there's a package that includes, let's say, slight pension cuts and some cuts here, but also increases the tax base of the ones that shy away from paying taxes, you would have more support in population. But just to go out and say austerity will solve it all, and then being surprised that you don't get a majority for that and people protest, well, this was expected, wasn't it?
Maria?
Well, I think there's a real issue in this country now, because we can talk about the names. Obviously, by now it's clear the government will collapse. It's also clear that when it comes to passing a budget, hands are tight. We also see that there's a real fiscal story that has to be addressed in terms of the spending of this country. The Prime Minister also made it clear, and I think it's an interesting debate, saying we have a country that is unable to grow. It has been unable to grow for the past few years, but also talked about this debate of the boomer economy, our system, the pension system, the way we pay and the way that we structure the public spending. spending has to be readdressed simply because of difficult demographics. What I would say very briefly, however, is I find the situation in France particularly concerning because this is not a question of this prime minister, of this government. There's going to be a new prime minister the same way we have a new prime minister every 4 months, 6 months. That is what they last. The fundamental issue, my view, is that the political system, you can't stretch it anymore. And we have an Emmanuel Macron who is, frankly, nationally, I don't think what else he can do. I think his hands are completely tied. This is the end of his mandate. And if anything, the only thing he can cling on to is the international agenda, which is why we're seeing that he's extremely active on the international. But this is now showing really the very limits of what the current republic can do. And also, he broke the two-party system. So I think there's a lot of dislocations also happening in the political system.
Deeply unpopular he is.
I don't totally
it's way beyond this prime minister.
But he could reach out to the, let's say, reasonable left and find compromises. And he is fueling that polarization.
But he would still not have a majority. That is a problem. You have a president that doesn't have a working majority because that would be blocked by the right. So the political equilibrium that he needs, it's basically impossible, which is bringing up the idea of whether he's going to again call for an election and try to change the makeup of the assembly.
Remember the outcome of the snap legislative
But as it stands, you have a country where he concentrates of the power, but he does not have a working majority, and that is not going to change with a new prime minister, a different makeup of a government.
Well, why is it so?
Well, we could spend an hour debating why, and we can say he made a lot of strategic mistakes over the past 3 years. Absolutely.
And he's not ready to cooperate with the pro-democratic forces for the country itself because he thinks he's going to win it again, and he can sideline them and put them into the extreme corners. And yes, there is some extreme left also in this opposition, but there's a lot of reasonable people there that are willing to cooperate, that are willing to work, and that have been kept aside by him, by Macron.
And meanwhile, we've seen Marine Le Pen. She wants elections as soon as possible.
Of course she does. No, of course she does. Okay, and she has her own motives, and we should not be naive about what.
But she may not be able to run, so I struggle to understand the logic.
My point in all of this is that we can criticize Macron's choices and lack of having built a new system after he destroyed the two-party system. Whatever you have, he's one of the best, strongest European leaders that I see on the scene in Europe. And if he's unable to somehow manage the situation, we will have a paralyzed France for another 2 years. That's very bad for Europe.
Yeah, but he's a king without a country more and more. He's good on the international level, but he's messing it up back home.
And that often happens, right? That people can be very popular outside, but domestically they are hated. But one thing we need to do keep an eye on that story. We'll follow it very closely for you here on Euronews, because of course Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, has also said that could potentially impact the stability of the Eurozone. We'll have an eye on that. But for now, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Stephen Everett, for being with us here. Maria Tadeo and Thomas Weitz. And if you would like to join in the discussion, please reach out, or if you just want to say hello, our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. Thank you so much again for watching. Take care and see you soon on Euronews.